You pressed play, but something else might be listening too. Can I ask you something? Where are you right now? And what time is it there? Tell me in the comments. Just don't listen too closely. Some things hear it when you do. Null had not been entered. It had been fallen into, not walked into, not discovered, not invited, only stumbled upon. The arrival had not been marked by light or sound. No door had opened. No transition had been felt. One moment, Julian Merrick had been stepping through a corridor in his office building, and the next, Null, a room without walls, yet defined by them, an expanse that had no borders, and yet every breath had pressed against the invisible shell of its confinement. The air had shifted instantly, colder, quieter, more hollow than silence should ever be. The floor had offered no echo. A sterile white film had coated every surface, ground columns and ceiling, smooth, seamless, and unnatural. The ceiling itself had hovered high above, somewhere between 10 and 15 meters, impossible to measure, yet always looming. Pillars had stretched into infinity, identical, equidistant, like teeth in the mouth of a god. No sound had existed, not even his own breath had returned to him. That was the first thing taken. Sound. The second had been time, not by its absence, but by its distortion. His watch had spun forward without rhythm. Hours had passed in moments, then slowed, then stilled, then reversed. No hunger had arrived, no thirst, only the crushing awareness that time had forgotten how to behave here. The third was presence, not his, another's, something unseen, far beyond the scope of human senses, and yet undeniably real. It had been felt behind the ribs, beneath the skin, in the back of the eyes, a gaze without direction, without origin, but constant, unblinking. Movement had become uncertain. Every step had felt repeated. Every turn had returned him to where he had just been. The pillars had mocked him. No markings, no variation, no help. In the distance, a mark had been noticed, a spot, not large, but deep in color, the only blemish in the endless white. Dark red, not liquid, not fresh, a growth, spongy, breathing, calling, but no step had been taken toward it. That instinct, at least, had remained intact, a sense that death lived near it, a warning not spoken, yet screamed in the mind. It had been avoided, watched from a distance, feared, respected. The silence had grown heavier with time. Julian's thoughts had begun to repeat. Memories had warped, names had faded, sensory deprivation had crept in, layer by layer. At times he had sworn he could feel his skin vibrating with phantom sounds that weren't there. At others, faces had appeared behind closed eyelids, too fast to recognize. But the worst had been the dreams. Dreams without sleep. Visions of walking endlessly in circles, finding old versions of himself curled up at the base of pillars, whispering incoherently, some smiling, some missing their eyes. No time had passed. Too much time had passed. Both had been true. Neither had mattered. And then something had changed. A noise, not heard, but registered. A low vibration, almost like thunder, but beneath the skin. A shift in the air. A warning without message. It had been understood. Null had noticed him, and soon it would make itself known. Null had not moved, yet something within it had begun to stir. The floor had remained still beneath Julian's feet. The pillars had remained fixed. The red growth had not changed shape, but the air had felt different, denser, colder, pressing inward, as if space itself had started to collapse quietly. A pressure had formed behind his ears, a sensation, not quite pain, but something dangerously adjacent, like the moment before a scream, like lungs expanding with no exhale. He had stopped walking. Stillness had felt safer, but in Null, stillness had also meant exposure. The temperature had dropped. His skin had started to sting. The white film beneath his hands had begun to feel organic, not warm, but reactive, as though something beneath it had pulsed once. Then again, the pulse had not matched his own heartbeat. It had been slower, deliberate, watching. Julian had crouched behind a nearby column, though he had known instinctively it would not protect him. There had been no angles in Null, no true shelter. Everything had been exposed from every direction. Still, hiding had felt human, and he had still clung to that. That was when he had first seen it, not clearly, just movement, not a shadow. Shadows had required light, and here there had only been the faintest sourceless glow. It had slid between two pillars, several meters ahead, brief, wrong in shape, almost quadrupedal, but fluid, like wind through a curtain soaked in water. There had been no footsteps, no breath, only presence. That familiar gaze now focused. It had passed without stopping, but it had known he was there. That had been clear. After it disappeared, the quiet had deepened, silence had turned violent, and then, a smell. The first, something between ozone and sulfur, sterile and electric, like scorched hospital sheets, soaked in blood. A sign. Null had changed again. He had moved, not out of bravery, but necessity. His legs had carried him forward, the space between columns now more narrow, though nothing had visibly shifted. The film beneath his feet had made no sound, and yet, something had started to echo behind him, but not footsteps. Dripping, regular, wet, too slow to be real, too rhythmic to be random. He had refused to look back. The rule had not been spoken, but it had been known. In Null, what follows cannot be faced, only felt, only endured. The temperature had shifted again. The tips of his fingers had numbed. His lips had cracked. Moisture had begun to abandon his body, and the air had thickened with what could only be described as the absence of hope. That's when the walls had appeared. Not physical walls, not tangible, but a change in perception. Suddenly directions had existed again. The space had narrowed. A corridor had taken form, and at the end of it, a door, perfectly square, film covered like everything else, closed, but waiting. Julian had approached. He had known it was a trap, but in Null there had only ever been two options: madness or movement. The door had not been touched, yet it had begun to open, not fast, not slow, inevitable. A seam had formed down its center, like skin parting under invisible pressure. Julian had stopped, but his feet had not obeyed. He had been pulled forward, not physically, but inwardly, as though the decision had already been made inside him, without consent, without hesitation. Behind the door, light had waited, not bright, not warm, but clinical, pale, vibrating slightly, as if filtered through water. Inside, the room had looked identical to the others. Same pillars, same ceiling, same film, except a chair, placed precisely in the center, facing nothing, but unmistakably facing. And in the chair, someone had been seated, not alive, but not lifeless, a body preserved without decay, dressed in tattered remnants of what may have once been ordinary clothes, a jacket, a shoe missing, fingers clasped around something, a note, crumpled, almost fused into the palm. The head had been tilted forward, as if asleep, but no breathing had moved the chest, no movement had twitched in the hands, only stillness, and something worse beneath it. Julian had approached, not by choice, by obligation. A whisper, not sound, but thought, had passed through him as he entered. This is what happens when you stay too long. The air in the room had tasted different, like dust soaked in static. The silence had not deepened. It had thickened, folding in on itself. Time had frozen, not metaphorically, literally. His watch, still ticking by some cruel miracle, had halted. The second hand had stood still, and yet, his breath had moved, only his. He had reached for the note. His hand had resisted. His shoulder had burned, but the paper had wanted to be read. It had unfolded slowly, flaking at the corners like burned leaves. The handwriting had been shaky, uneven, but human, still human, and it had said, "This place is not empty. It watches, it waits. I stayed, I listened. Now it wears my skin. If you're reading this, it's behind you." Julian had not turned around. He had known. The rule had been felt. What follows must never be faced, but it had already begun to whisper. Not in words, in memory. Scenes from his past had flickered in his mind. His father's voice, but pitched wrong. A birthday party that had never happened. The smell of rain from a city he had never visited. Null had reached inside him, rearranging what had made him real. The body in the chair had twitched, only once, enough to let him know. It had never been a corpse. It had been a warning. A mirror, and then the room had shifted. The pillars had bent. The ceiling had lowered. The door behind him had vanished. There had only ever been one way forward, and now, that way had vanished too. The walls had not collapsed, but space had shrunk. The pillars had drawn inward. Their spacing, once endless, had now formed a labyrinth, a maze of sameness. Each corridor had led back to the chair and to the figure, still seated, still waiting. But now its head had lifted. Julian had not dared to look at its face, but the shape of it had changed, not aged, not decayed, familiar, too familiar. Its posture had mirrored its breath had matched his rhythm, even its trembling. Identical, a perfect reflection, carved in flesh. He had moved again, trying to escape the loop, pressing between pillars, slipping through thin gaps where his shoulders had barely fit. But Null had known him now, not just his body, his mind, his voice, his fear. It had worn it, like a cloak. Each step had brought new changes, new copies, some staring back, others standing completely still. One had whispered his name as he passed, though no lips had moved. Another had mimed a scream, locked in eternal silence. Some had lacked eyes, some had lacked faces altogether, yet all had looked like him. That was the final revelation. Null had not been a place, not truly. It had been a mirror, a concept, a prison shaped by recognition, a trap that could only function if the subject saw itself and did not look away. The red fungus had reappeared, in every corner now, spreading from beneath the columns, pulsing with sick rhythm. It had always been alive, but now it had grown confident, no longer a threat, but a harbinger. The air had grown heavier, breathing had become a labor, vision had started to fracture, edges darkening, the glow dimming. Julian had stumbled, fallen. The floor had welcomed him like water. No splash, only absorption. The chair had appeared again, but empty now, waiting. He had crawled forward, not to sit, but to see, to understand, to end it. And when he had reached it, his own body had been found already seated, not asleep, not dead, but replaced. And the one now approaching had not been him anymore, only the part that had been allowed to remain. The rest had stayed behind, as it always did, as it always would. Null had not consumed him. It had duplicated him, filtered him, carved away what it wanted to keep, and returned the rest. A shell, a memory, a survivor. But outside, no time had passed, no hours, no days, only seconds. And in the ordinary world, a man had awakened on a busy street, with white dust on his shoes, and a strange ticking in his ears. He had no memory of what had happened, only the sensation of being watched forever. And Null had not closed, because Null never does. It only waits, quietly, behind the moments when silence grows too deep, behind doorways that shouldn't be there, behind you. The town had been built on stillness. Willcroft Hollow, tucked deep into Florida's mangrove-thick coastlines, had existed mostly in whispers, a place where nothing happened and everything stayed the same. That illusion had shattered on March 17th. The house on Ferndale Street had once belonged to a local pharmacist named Michael Riley, a quiet man, solitary, known more for his punctual hours and pristine lawn than for any real connection to the community. But Michael Riley had been found dead. Not just dead, consumed. The discovery had not been made by police. Not at first. It had been a neighbor who had sounded the alarm, a woman named Judith Page, who had glimpsed a man staggering down the street at dawn. He had been barefoot, stained from the chin down in something thick and blackened by clot. His hands had glistened in the early morning light, not from sweat, but from blood. When officers arrived, they had found the man sitting cross-legged in the front yard of the Riley home, humming something tuneless and low. He had not resisted arrest. He had smiled. His name had been given as Charles Emery, age 59, a transient known to drift through the southeastern counties during the colder months. What had been found inside the house had changed everything. The basement had been locked from the outside. Inside, a scene of carnage. Michael Riley's body had been discovered in pieces. No part had been left untouched. Eyes removed, tongue severed, fingers gnawed to bone. The neck had been torn wide, not cut, but ripped, as if by animal teeth. The most intimate mutilations had not been listed in the public report. The air had reeked of metal, rot, and something disturbingly sweet, jammed between human and artificial decay. But that had not been the strangest part. Charles Emery, when questioned, had confessed almost immediately, but not with clarity, with conviction. He had claimed that he had been the victim. That days earlier, he had been invited inside by Riley for a meal, cold ham sandwiches and lemonade. The food, he'd said, had been drugged. He had awakened tied to a basement chair, wrists rubbed raw from the ropes, with Riley standing in front of him, wearing a mask and a dress, a costume, according to Emery, of an old woman that Riley called Margaret. He had said the name with such trembling fear that the detectives had exchanged glances without speaking. Margaret had not been found. No mask, no wigs, no proof. Only Emery's word, rambling, inconsistent, delivered between fits of sobbing and guttural laughter. And the body, torn apart with teeth. Forensics had confirmed that most of the bite marks matched Emery's dental impressions. And yet, not all of them. Some were smaller, some sharper, some impossibly wide. Authorities had searched the entire house, drawers, closets, attic space. A single drawer had yielded dozens of prescriptions for sedatives and sleep aids, all filled legally. The kitchen had been clean, meticulously so. The bedroom, however, had been unsettling. A twin-sized mattress, stained with old sweat, dozens of spiral notebooks filled with repetitive lines, some pages nothing but the same name, written hundreds of times. Margaret. No digital records had existed, no social media, no outgoing calls, only one incoming number, called regularly, but disconnected, since before the incident. When traced, it had belonged to a landline from a senior care facility, destroyed in a fire 5 years prior. The file had gone cold after that, but something in the town had stayed cold too, as if the house had changed the air itself. The house on Ferndale had been sealed. A yellow cordon had been wrapped tight around the property, but the whispers had already breached it. Children had dared each other to touch the front porch. Neighbors had begun locking their doors before sunset, not because of Charles Emery, because of what he described, because of Margaret. Emery had been moved to a psychiatric wing. His trial had been indefinitely postponed after a series of episodes, some violent, some catatonic. Nurses had reported whispering at night, words repeated like rituals, words that made no sense to anyone listening, and yet they had sounded familiar, as if spoken by someone long dead. The attending psychiatrist, Dr. Alana Moore, had kept detailed notes. In her second week of sessions, she had noticed a disturbing pattern. Each time Emery spoke of the mask, his vitals had spiked, heart rate elevated, pupils dilated. Sweat had collected along his temples, even in the coldest corners of the room. but his eyes had not blinked. Not once. They had remained wide, fixed on a corner of the ceiling behind her, as if someone had been standing there. Dr. Moore had grown curious, too curious. She had petitioned for access to the home. Her request had been denied, then approved, then withdrawn again, when 2 officers on the initial crime scene had gone on early leave, one citing insomnia and hallucinations, the other found muttering alone in his garage. She had entered anyway, alone. The house had felt wrong, not haunted, occupied. Dust had already begun reclaiming the floor, but in the living room, footprints had been found. Not boots, not bare feet, heeled shoes, small, too small for any man. Yet the drag marks beside them had looked like something had been carried or dragged. In the basement, the lights had refused to work. A generator had been set up, but the moment power was restored, every bulb had blown. The chair remained, the rope frayed, the floor still stained despite repeated cleanings. But something new had been found beneath the stairs, tucked inside a ventilation panel. A wig, gray, synthetic, caked in old sweat, and something darker, clutched inside the wig's mesh netting. A brooch, gold-plated, inscribed on the back with a single word, Maggie. No dress had been recovered, no mask, but the object had been sent for testing. Skin cells had been lifted, not Riley's, not Emery's, not anyone in any database. Dr. Moore had filed the report, but weeks later she had stopped coming to work. No resignation, no warning. Her apartment had been found open, lights on, dinner half eaten. Inside her bedroom closet, her own clothes had been torn down from the racks, replaced with an old floral dress and a gray wig set carefully on the shelf above it. No sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, only a single smudge on the bedroom mirror, a pale oval, as if a mask had been pressed gently against the glass and breathed. Dr. Moore had never been found, only her shadow had remained, captured briefly in the frame of a neighbor's doorbell camera, standing outside her own building at 3:41 a.m., staring into nothing, wearing something floral. She had not been seen again. The Riley case had faded from headlines, but not from Willcroft Hollow. Children no longer played in their front yards. Pet cats had stopped returning home. A postman had refused to deliver mail down Ferndale altogether, citing chest pressure and nausea whenever he approached the sidewalk. No one had laughed at the superstition, because no one could explain the sound. It had started as a low hum, barely noticeable beneath the hum of air conditioners and cicadas, but those who lived closest to the house began to hear it more clearly. Always after midnight, a voice, not singing, not speaking, repeating. Sometimes just a name, sometimes just one. Charles, other times, Maggie. The house had remained empty, but lights had been seen in the windows, not electric, flickering, as if candles had been lit behind drawn curtains. No flames ever found, no sense of wax or oil, but black wax had been discovered near the side door melted into the porch wood. Inside, when police had forced entry again after a series of 911 hang-ups traced to Riley's old landline, they had found the basement changed. The walls had been marked, not with paint, with nails, scratches gouged into the drywall, dozens, hundreds of them, in shapes that resembled handwriting, though no words could be made out. The original crime scene photographs had been reviewed again. Those scratches had not been there before. In the corner of the basement floor, a new trapdoor had been noticed, not professionally made, rough wood, hinged with mismatched brackets and partially covered with a thin throw rug that hadn't existed before. When opened, the space below had been found lined with mirrors, 12 of them, placed in a circle. Each one tilted inward, each one covered in gray film, similar to the substance found on the dress fabric in wig fibers weeks prior, and in the center, a chair, not the same one from the torture scene. This one smaller, child-sized. A name had been etched into the back of the seat. Not Riley, not Emery, Lorraine. That name had not been mentioned in any statement, not in any note, not in any report. Only once by Emery, during his first breakdown in the intake room, before the cameras had even been turned on. Transcribed later by a nurse who had overheard it, whispered, "She said her name wasn't Margaret. She said it was Lorraine now. She said I was hers now." Later that night, the trapdoor had sealed itself. No matter how many tools were used, it would not open again. The mirrors had never been recovered, but their reflections had remained in dreams. Charles Emery had stopped speaking. No outbursts, no babbling, no whispers, only silence. His body had remained intact, but his eyes had changed. They no longer tracked movement. They no longer blinked in response to light. They had simply stared, straight ahead, at something behind the wall no one else could see. He had been found one morning with blood on his tongue, and no wounds in his mouth. 2 of his fingers had been bitten off during the night. No teeth marks had matched his own. The psychiatric facility had undergone investigation. Staff turnover had spiked. 3 nurses had quit within 24 hours of one another, citing persistent dreams of being tied to a chair, a woman's voice whispering numbers in their ears, and a mirror that cracked every time they looked into it. One orderly had attempted to burn his own eyes out with sterilizing fluid. He had failed, but when questioned, he'd said only this: "She smiled in the glass. She smiled with my mother's face." The Riley house had finally been scheduled for demolition. The town had raised the funds, but every demolition crew had withdrawn by the time the bulldozers were supposed to arrive. They had reported accidents, mechanical failure, sudden illnesses. One foreman had woken up the night before with deep ligature bruises around his ankles and wrists. He had lived alone. No one else had keys to his apartment. Eventually, the permit had been canceled. The lot had been marked as condemned. Steel fencing had been erected, but at night, locals had still seen shadows moving inside, and always a flicker of candlelight from the basement window. 5 months later, a girl had vanished, 12 years old, seen last riding her bike near Ferndale Street. The tires had been found in the gutter, twisted and flat, but the frame had never been located. A single item had been discovered beneath the hedge near the Riley home, a plastic Halloween mask, not commercially made, molded from papier-mâché, painted to resemble an old woman, lips too red, cheeks exaggerated, eyes hollow. Inside, the name Lorraine had been written in block letters, again and again, like a child practicing cursive in reverse. The mask had been taken into evidence, but 2 days later, it had gone missing. No record of who had handled it last, only a note in the logbook, written in a shaky hand. She asked to go home. The town had stopped asking questions after that, because the answers had become patterned, predictable. Every few years, another shadow, another name whispered in the dark, another chair discovered in an empty room. Always the same voice, low and cracked: "Say my name." Charles Emery had died in his sleep. Autopsy results had listed heart failure, but beneath his tongue, a single tooth had been placed, not his own, an infant's. No explanation given, no family to claim the body. He had been buried in an unmarked grave 2 counties over, but the grave had been dug up 3 weeks later. The coffin found open, the body gone. Only the floral dress had remained, folded neatly, placed across the lining. A handwritten note had rested beside it. 4 words only, in red crayon: "You shouldn't have looked." The house on Ferndale still stands. The grass grows higher now. The candles never seem to run out, and at night, from behind certain windows, a shape can be seen watching the street, not moving, not breathing, just waiting. Because Lorraine had never been invented, she had only been invited.